But that being said, we are going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Matt Reichert. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement at GIA. I also teach at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University in central Minnesota. In addition to that, I co-direct the One Call Institute, whose mission really is to engage, support, and empower young people to become involved in liturgical ministry in their parishes. So there's a lot of things that we'll be talking about today that have a particular application there for the work of One Call. We're going to go in the order that I see you in my screen here. So Jenna, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself next, please.
Great. Thanks, Matt. My name is Jenna Thorough Mountain, and I'm a high school theology teacher and campus minister. Most recently, I've worked at an all-girls Catholic high school out in Los Angeles, but I am now on the East Coast, and I'll be starting at a school here in New York in just about a month or two. I've worked with high school students, college students in campus ministry contexts, and actually all the way through the lifespan when I did CPE at a long-term care facility with 80 to 90-year-olds. So I've kind of worn a lot of different hats in that respect. And I also write various religious education resources and liturgy resources for publishers like LTP and the Liturgical Press. But I'm excited for today's conversation.
Great, thanks, Jenna. We're really glad that you're here. And Chris, if you'd introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Chris Estrella. I'm from Southern California over here. So Jen and I were in the same area for a little while when she lived down here. I'm the coordinator of liturgical music for the Diocese of San Bernardino, which is one of the biggest dioceses in the country, very culturally diverse diocese. I've been working here for several years. Also have been a parish youth minister for over 12 years, parish youth catechist, about 8 years of experience of that, young adult ministry for about 5 years. And so, kind of been on both sides of the tracks, working with young people, and then in my diocesan work, working with people of all ages and all walks of life. And additionally to that, I'm a artist, composer, and presenter, musician for Oregon Catholic Press, OCP, which is a fellow publisher to GIA. So it's just an honor to be here. It's a great conversation, one of my favorite topics to have. And so thank you very much for having us, Matt.
Great, wonderful, and thanks again to both of you for being here. So one of the things that we want to do, and again, attendees, those of you attending live, you can feel free at any time to add a question into the Q&A. Even if we're not to that point in our conversation yet, we'll be sure to get to it. What I want to do just really quickly is do a little bit to establish foundational understanding for what we're talking about. Do a little bit of the theory right now so we can get into the application. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly here with everybody, and hopefully you can see what this looks like. Are you able to see a blank screen right now? More or less? Okay, great. So, and I'm not going to take a lot of our time here at the beginning because I want to get to our own particular ministerial experiences. But just so we have an understanding, a common understanding for the purpose of this conversation, I want to do just two really quick things. First of all, when we talk about generations and generations today, let's just sort of put a flag in the ground for what we mean for the purpose of this conversation. And so I'm going to put up here a list of generations who are alive and active today in 2020. Now, as you're looking at this list, these generational labels might be familiar to you. These generational year boundaries for a year of birth might be familiar. They might not be, or you might have heard of a generation called something different, or might understand the start and cutoff points for these generations to be different. What I want to suggest by putting this up here is a couple of things. First of all, that generational study is a soft science, right? We have different understandings, and depending on who you talk to, someone might say millennials or Gen Y really begin with the year 1981, 1982, or 1978, right? So this is going to be a little bit of a fluid, fuzzy beginning and ending point for each generation. So as we're talking about this, I think that underscores two things. The generational theories that we're going to talk about have real implication and real application. Again, because this is a soft science, this isn't going to be definitive for every single person, right? We're talking about some of these generalized realities for people. And so I want to be careful about us saying the following things we say about Generation X are true for everybody who was born between 1965 and 1980, because of course that's not going to be true. We're talking about generalized things. And from research to research, from resource to resource, some of our labels and some of our starting and ending points are going to be a little different. But for the purpose of this conversation, here's how we'll start to understand things, okay? Second big thing in terms of just foundational elements is if we talk about generational experience and what contributes to the differences in generational experience, it's not our goal, at least I'm speaking on behalf of the three of us, so if I get something wrong, Jenna or Chris, please correct me. But it is not our suggestion to look at this list of generations. I'm going to put these back up here really quickly, to diagnose any generation's experience as more or less than the experience of any other generation. That is not the point, right? Instead, what we want to talk about are what are the contributing factors that result in differences, perhaps in a worldview or experience or understanding between generations. So this isn't a judgment of those experiences. This is understanding the factors that lead to the difference, if that makes sense. And I hope I said that okay, but we'll suss that out more as time goes on. So final foundational thing. If we look at these sources, okay, if we look at the sources of generational difference, and the information that I'm putting up here, by the way, is drawn from a variety of researchers who look at generational differences, and I'll put some of the links to the resources that you can check out into the chat, and then also into our follow-up email. But there are a couple of layers that we need to be attuned to if we want to understand the differences between any generation, no matter what generations we're talking about. First of all, one of the first sources of age diversity is going to be what researchers call life cycle effects. So, and as is written here, young people are going to differ from older people, but may resemble them later in life. What this means in terms of life cycle effects is, unless there are any 12-year-olds on the webinar today, all of us who are on the webinar have been 13 years of age at some point. And so there are things about my experience when I was 13 that might be similar to what it was like for my mom or my dad when they were 13, or my grandparents when they were 13. So being 13, being 20, being 6, right, is a part of the life cycle that all of us experience, and so we have that similarity, okay? So that's one layer. The next layer causes some of that point of divergence, however. So major events affect people differently because of where we are in the life cycle. So just because I was 13 and my dad was 13 does not mean that our experience of being 13 was necessarily the same, because of all the other things that were going on at the period when each of us was 13. That makes sense, right? So my dad was 13 in 1972. I was 13 in 1995. My grandfather was 13 in 1942. And you can all do the math then in terms of when we were all born. But because of what was going on in the world in 1942, 1972, 1995, that developmental period when our worldview, our processes, our likes, our dislikes, our values, the way we make reasoned choices, all those are becoming hardwired at that developmental part of life. They're also affected by all the things that are going on around us. So that's one source of why one generation might see something a little bit differently. What are the period effects that were happening? These major points on the life timeline. And then finally, third layer, and then I'll stop sharing my screen and we can start to get into some of this, are cohort effects. So again, period events and trends influence young adults, older adults, developing core values, developing identity, but it happens as a particular generational cohort, right? So if you think about things like the experience of middle schoolers today, high schoolers today, and Jenna, I'm sure you can speak to this as a high school teacher, when you see what the experience of this cohort of high school students is like, what learning is like in high school in 2020, and how that's different than those of us in the late 90s, early 2000s experienced high school, or high school in the 70s, or high school in the 50s. There's a cohort effect that also influences people's diversity in terms of generational diversity. So again, where we are in the life cycle, what's happening in the world around us, and then for the group of people who are approximate in our age, what's happening within that particular cohort, all conspires to affect worldview, the way we understand things, the way that we interpret what's happening from moment to moment. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. If I can find my mouse here. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And what I'd like to do, Chris and Jenna, is just jump in right here. So we've laid out sort of what generations we're talking about and what some of the contributing factors are to how people, depending on what generation they fall in, why we see things differently. So let's jump in there. And Chris, maybe if I could have you begin here, as you are working with young people and also as you're working with adults in ministry, talking about generational differences. In your conversation, in your questions and what you observe, do you see these things like period effect or cohort effect or some of these differences in the worldview showing up in the conversations or the types of questions you get as you go from parish to parish?
Absolutely. You know, in my work as a coordinator of music for my diocese, you know, there's a lot of conversation about practices of how we're going to practice in our parishes. My diocese has about 95-ish parishes or something like that, and so every parish has a sort of a different identity, a different personality, and then a lot of the I would say the period effects, because depending on the age of the people that I'm talking with about, you know, what kind of music you're going to do in your parish, it seems like there's a big benchmark for a lot of the boomers and some of the older people that do ministry in the parishes. There's a benchmark of referring to Vatican II. A lot of times that's sort of like, you know, they'll say, oh, I remember Vatican II, and you know, it's kind of like no matter where we are in a conversation, they'll bring it over to Vatican II, you know. And for a young person nowadays, and you know, there are young people that are in their late teens or early 20s in college, and they're serving as music ministers. And when someone brings up that idea, like, oh, you know, and then Vatican II, it's sort of like that's such a far removed time period from when this person was even born, that it almost has zero effect on them. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, you remember Vatican II? Like, no, I wasn't born until 40 years after that or 50 years after that. So there's and sometimes that term is used for effect, kind of like, oh, you think this change is big? Think about Vatican II. And it's kind of like they were born into what is almost kind of considered by some people to be kind of like a Vatican III diet version. You know what I mean? So the with the new Roman Missal that was enacted in 2010 and 11. So young people nowadays, the younger generations of pastoral musicians, they're looking at the things that they're thinking about when it comes to enhancing parish music ministry. They have a completely different value system a lot of times, and they're trying to say, how can we make this music, how can we make it better with our instrumentation? How can we do this? How can we do that? How can we do that? And then some older generations sometimes have a completely different perspective on it, because sometimes it's about how can we get better without changing as much, or sometimes how can we get better while changing a lot. And for a younger person, it's kind of like, what's the utility of it? Where, you know, like how can we, what do we have to throw out in order to get better? And the idea of throwing out sometimes scares other generations. like okay, we don't need that anymore. We can, you know, here's this new thing, here's this new technology, here's this new version of an instrument, here's this new instrument itself. And our church being so based and rooted in tradition, in the idea of tradition itself being a value of our church, that sometimes scares people. And, you know, and of course, not to say that older generations, that's all they care about, because there are people on both sides of the tracks. I mean, Jenna could even could even attest to this, that there's a community of young people, like a college age group of people that are very traditionalist at the same time. And they almost want to get rid of all the new stuff that's out there. And they don't like new hymns. They like traditional hymns. They like the high mass. They like Latin and things like that. So there are people in every generation that are on kind of both sides of the tracks of contemporary practice versus traditionalism. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of, that you can't just box somebody into based off of where their age or anything like that. You can't box them in and say, this is what this person cares about, and this is what this person cares about solely based on their age. My diocese, the last thing I'll say right now is my diocese is a very ethnic diocese. I think we're something like 80% Hispanic. And so, sometimes in other churches, other parts of the country, within one city, a parish will have one parish that's kind of like, that's the Spanish parish in this city, and the other one's, oh, that's the Polish parish, or this is the German parish. In my diocese over here, it's overwhelmingly Spanish, actually. There are no parishes in my diocese that don't have a Spanish mass. So every parish is Hispanic in its own way, and English is actually the secondary one. So depending on where you go, sometimes you'll find a parish that has no English masses but has all Spanish masses, or you'll find parishes that have a combination. And I think that is also part of the experience that young people have nowadays, is their cultural upbringing. The culture has a big impact on the way that they perceive and view the world. And there's this, I think it's a USCCB program they call it BICM, Building Intercultural Competence for Ministers. And that really highlights that it's not only age difference that can define what's different about us. It's also cultural difference, about having a family that's authoritarian versus something that's more empowering or something like that. And so, yeah, there's so much to talk about this. It's just incredible. But I really wanted to highlight that the period is actually a really important thing to think about, because sometimes, like I think Matt had said in our pre-session, that sometimes, you'll hear in a homily, you'll hear a reference that completely lands depending on who's listening to it, and other people are like, what are you even talking about? There's a deacon in my parish. I love him. He's one of my favorite guys in the world. His name is Deacon Mock. We're in Southern California, but he's from Boston, so it's Deacon Mock with no R. And he loves to make Simpsons references in his homilies, and all the older people are just cracking up. Oh, the Simpsons! Our teenagers have never seen the Simpsons before, and that's incredible to think that they've never seen the Simpsons before. But our teenagers have never seen that, so those just fly right over their heads.
I know from as a classroom teacher, I remember, like, I thought maybe it would be a slow change. It was like a light switch from one year when all of my cultural references made sense and people got it and got the joke, to the next year when nothing. And I thought, I need to see newer movies and listen to newer music. But Jenna, what about you? I mean, you mentioned both your ministerial context, being kept in campus ministry, and also being in a high school setting. As you think about, again, the period and life cycle and cohort effects, like, do you see these differences show up? Where does that come up for you?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, in what you shared, Matt, the cohort effects are what kind of rise to the surface, particularly in terms of what education looks like for high schoolers today. It looks really vastly different than when I was in high school. And then how technology plays a really large role in that as well. I mean, you can look at, most high schools have invested heavily in things like smart boards, which is allowing us to do an incredible number of things in our classrooms. And now that we've moved to a lot of online learning across the country because of the pandemic, we're investing in technologies like Zoom or Edpuzzle for anyone like who's on the education spectrum and have used any of those sorts of resources. And I want to highlight something that I've noticed when we talk about the generation of Gen Z, is that they're the technology generation who have really grown up with it, and even at a very young age have owned cell phones, right, or iPads or computers. And I think that there's kind of a both and of, you know, yes, Gen Z is familiar with technology, and my students tell me about spending their days on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and just all those things eating their days away. So we need to, I think, extend the faith to them through those technology venues, certainly, like bringing things to youth where they're at. But I think there's a second part of also helping them cultivate healthy relationships with technology, and especially, you know, in a time of online learning when students are staring at screens. I found it really important in the springtime when we shifted to online learning at my school to give them opportunities and to encourage them to take things off screen. So to open a physical journal and to do their assignment with a pen and paper, to get some art supplies and express themselves that way, or to go outside and take a walk in nature. I mean, it's just a habit of self-care that I think if we're not helping students to do these things and giving them opportunities to do that as like part of our teaching ministry and our church ministry, they may lose out on that, and that's going to affect, you know, their entire being in terms of health, psychological health, mental health, physical health as well.
Yeah, I think what both of you mentioned in your examples, I think, serves to underscore the since we oftentimes, and again, I'm speaking in generalizations, so I don't know, attendees, if this is going to resonate with either your own experience of your own practice or the people with whom you serve, but oftentimes our degree of understanding for people in other generations, and we're talking about primarily younger people because I know we work with younger people, but when we look at younger generations in particular, stops with, I remember what it was like to be in high school. And that might be true. But if we don't have an intentional awareness of that period and cohort effect and how it's different for kids in high school now, as opposed to myself later, it's harder for us to authentically honor experience, but also to understand and just have a conversation and reach and make sure that what we are trying to communicate is in fact being communicated. So I'll give you some examples of just the difference in terms of period effect. I was mentioning this to Chris and Jenna before we let all of you in the room and started the session, but Beloit College in Wisconsin used to do something, and I don't know if they still do it. So if someone's watching live and you know they do this, say so in the chat. But they used to develop what was called the mindset list. And every year, what Beloit College would do for their faculty, and then all of us at other colleges would steal it from them, was they would come up with a list of things that were true about the incoming freshman class, so that we could get a sense of the context of their life experience compared to ours and what assumptions we would make in the way we taught our classes. And it was super helpful. So some of those, the mindset list basically highlighted period and cohort effects. So some of the period effects it would highlight, for example, was, you know, for last year's incoming freshmen, they were all born in the same year or after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. So if you think about just that example, you know, if you were to say to somebody like me who was 18 when the September 11th attacks happened, where were you on September 11th? I would know exactly what you meant. Just like if you asked my grandfather, where were you on December 7th? He would know you were talking about when Pearl Harbor was attacked. But if you ask someone, a younger person today, where were you on September 11th? They may or may not, they'll have an equal chance of not understanding which year you mean, as opposed to understanding that it was 2001. An update from Andrew: Beloit does not sponsor the list, but Marist College has taken it on. So it's something that people can look for. But again, that understanding is different. And so by looking at the differences in period effect, you know, for a college student today or younger, the United States has never been in a period where we weren't tackling global terrorism, right? I can remember flying and, you know, my parents coming with me right to the gate, not having to go through security, right? And it's unthinkable now, right? But for some worldview, we just don't have it. Another one, and this isn't a political commentary, but for a lot of high school and college students, there has never been a point in their aware lives when the president, Donald Trump, has not been a politician. You can remember in the mid 2000s when he started to get involved in politics and people thought it was weird, reality TV star. But for a whole host of people, that's never been their experience, right? So anyway, the reason I'm taking up the time to mention this is to say, if we think about those period effects, how is the amount of time someone's been alive and what's been true for them different from what's been true for people in other generations? Let's think about what that means for the church for a second. If we put together our own Beloit or Marist College list, but just for Catholics, right? This year we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the new translation. And again, I know we shouldn't call it the new translation anymore, it's a decade old, but the most recent translation. So if you're in a part of the country like I am, where about second grade is where you go through First Communion prep, the first group of students to go through First Communion, First Holy Communion prep and sacrament and receiving the sacrament with the new 10-year-old translation are 18 years old now, maybe 19, 17, 18, 19, something like that. So for that whole generation of Catholics, this isn't the new translation, it's the translation that they're aware of, right? If you look at something like what Bob McCarty has done with St. Mary's Press and the Going, Gone disaffiliation among young Catholics, when young Catholics list the reasons for their disaffiliation, oftentimes people assume it has to be clergy sex abuse crisis. What they found was, in asking people to list the reasons, that was actually towards the bottom of the list, not because it wasn't important, but because younger Catholics, if 2002 Boston Spotlight is our benchmark, for younger Catholics, they have always lived in a post-sex abuse church. And the church hasn't had the standing that it lost in that crisis. It's always not had that type of credibility. So again, if we look at understanding generational differences, I feel like we need to put together a church mindset list for young Catholics. And I'm not sure if any of that resonates with your own experience or insight, Chris or Jenna, if there are other things we should add to that list, but it seems to me if we're trying to figure out where the mindset and the worldview of younger Catholics are to engage them, we have to start putting some of those things onto a timeline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that would be absolutely helpful, Matt, to have our own mindset list. One thing that comes to mind from my experience with high school students is, I've witnessed my students' just real passion for social justice issues, and namely their concern for the environment, for the climate crisis that they've essentially grown up with, just greater awareness of the crisis that we find ourselves in. So I think that, and then other just basic social justice issues, like poverty, racism, the protests of the past, month or two in this summer as well, are going to be formative events for young people, all the way heading into college, right? And I've found that actually, I don't have like specific data to back me up on this. I'm sure I could do some digging, but some of the frustration I've heard from high school students about, well, older generations have left us with, a world that is groaning, an earth that is in dire need of care, right? And just their frustration about that, and about sense of justice and rights of people in this country, I think has kind of soured their interpretation of what tradition is. So I think Chris brought up tradition earlier, and that, in theology classes, it's really difficult to kind of explain to them what tradition is and what it's not, that it doesn't just mean handing on some rules to follow, but it's a living tradition that unites us with, our ancestors, and all the way back to the early church and the time of Jesus Christ. That kind of shifting their perspective that way to say, well, this isn't just another thing, another problem to solve that you can just throw out the old ways of the past, but there's some value to the lived tradition of the Christian church, I think is a place to start breaking open some dialogue, especially with Gen Z that I've engaged with.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some incredible things that based off of Matt and Jenna's examples of, depending on like the mindset on what you've lived through and what you've experienced and what you've been around for, that influence your opinion about what there currently is. I'll throw one more example before I talk about it. I was born in the very late '80s, so I'm in my early 30s right now, and if I was born in 1988, so about around 1998, I was about 10 years old, and that was 1998 was the last. This is a lighter example. It was the last championship of Michael Jordan, right? 1998, and so I was barely at that formative age of 10 when I started really caring about sports. And I saw Michael Jordan's last championship, and then so I was part of this generation, the end of it, where they say Michael Jordan is just the greatest basketball player who ever lived. Anyone that was born around 1998 or something like that, or in the early 2000s, they've never seen Michael Jordan really play before. So they grew up with other people like Kobe Bryant and specifically LeBron James. And so then you get these young people nowadays that say, LeBron James is the greatest basketball player that ever lived. But the older generations say, no, how could you believe that? How could you possibly believe that? Michael Jordan is the greatest that ever lived. There's no question about it. But these people never saw that. They never experienced that. So they have a very distinct opinion based off of what they have seen. And now going back to the way it applies in church with the priest sexual abuse scandals and things like that. Right now, there's the younger generations, they have, there's this sort of trait that they tend to do. And they do this thing where they question certain aspects of the faith. They question the faith in ways that maybe in decades past were never questioned. Things like, with Proposition 8 and homosexual marriage and things like that. You get young people that care more about that than they do about the priest sex abuse scandals. That could be higher up on the list. So this is why I don't like the church, is because the church seems anti-homosexual sometimes, depending on the way you interpret its rules and things like that. And we have our Catholic social teaching that explain very clearly, how those work. But we're talking about a group mindset that young people are buying into. And I think also there's a really big influence of social media. Social media plays a huge influence on the way that young people form opinions. And like Jenna had said, living on TikTok and living on YouTube and stuff like that. She didn't say Facebook because young people don't live on Facebook anymore. But and there's even like MySpace from back in the farther days, even farther back. But right now, if you go to Instagram, if you go to Twitter and things like that, you'll find graphics and memes and images, and those things are heavy contributors to a person's actual personal opinion. And I think it would be an unfair generalization to say that because of this, young people, they just kind of blindly follow whatever looks the best to them. I don't think that's true either. I think that this is just this is their version of reading. You know what I mean? This is the new generation's version of trying to do their research. And the caveat of it is that not all of it's true. So on social media, you see all kinds of untrue statements, and people are taking that and they're internalizing it, and it's going from their eyes to their head to their heart. And now they're saying, this is, okay, based off of what I've read here, I'm going to form my own opinion. And when it comes to the church, the young people are taking that and they're questioning. And I would say questioning more than challenging. And other generations may interpret that as challenging. Say, hey, why do you keep on asking these questions? Why do you keep on questioning this stuff? We never questioned that stuff when I was younger. Why are you making a big deal out of this? Why are you making a stink out of this thing? But it's not that they're making a bigger deal out of something that shouldn't be made a big deal out of. They're processing their values, their own version of values, which are distinctively different from other generations. Not better, not worse, but different. They're processing their values in a different way than generations before them. So as a generation of the church that always grew up saying, and with your spirit, and never makes the mistake of saying, and also with you. But then you go to a church and you hear some people who have been alive since 1898, and they're saying, and also with you. It's the way that they grew up. It's the life that you grew up in. It's the church that you grew up in. And it's unfortunate, the example that Matt gave about how they're growing up in a church that has seen scandal their entire life. But that is the faith that not only are they dealing with, but a percentage of them are sticking with,
Mhm.
despite that. Despite the church's struggles that they've lived through their entire life, there's a good percentage of them that are sticking to it. And I think that's something that needs to be commended as much as the percentage that are leaving need to be attended to. I hope that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's also, Chris, that, yeah, asking questions doesn't need to be interpreted as a threat,
Yes.
right? Like, I remember when I was first going into high school teaching, a priest said to me, "Oh, God bless you. I can't handle high school students. They just ask all these questions. I don't know how to answer their questions." But, we can look at the life cycle and tell that it's not just generational. It's also, yeah, about where they're at in life, that needing a space to ask these questions and engage some of these issues is simply, where young people are at. So providing a space for that, where I don't feel that you're threatening my faith or you're threatening the Catholic Church, but we can have a dialogue and be the transparent, honest church that I think the world needs right now.
Well, and I want to pick up with that, and I want to, if it's okay with you to, if we let's stick with this, Generation Z, sort of younger people in high school and college right now as an example, just to to look at a specific case study of a generation, and then we can extrapolate to other generations. Before we do that, Chris, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Diana McElintel is also adding Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Magic Johnson and Go Lakers. So
There you go. There you go.
So I
Kudos
want
to you, Diana. I'm Laker fan here.
So I want to share my screen one more time, and what I'm going to put up here right now is these are going to be characteristics of Generation Z right now. So again, we're going to use Generation Z as a case study, keeping in mind that if we stop and ask ourselves, what was parenting, education, religious education, politics, global news, all of those things for any generation, we could create a list like this there. Okay, but we're just going to stick with Generation Z for a moment. So if you think about who Generation Z is and what's true about their life experience. So this is cohort information informed by period effect at a point in the life cycle. So if you were there at the beginning of the conversation, you know what I'm talking about. So if I've grown up, if I'm in high school or college today, I have always been around the internet. I can remember, I am 37 years old as of the date of this broadcast, and I can remember in middle school when we got AOL dial-up, where you'd like start to log in and then you'd go get ready for the day, and by the time you'd come back, it finally would have dialed up the internet. It was super slow. Now, anybody can look up anything because I have my phone, right? Or I have Alexa, who I can ask how many tablespoons are in a cup or whatever. Like I can do that in my kitchen and immediately I get information. So think about this, and this is what I would encourage participants to think about as we are looking at what this means for church practice, right? If I am a young person who is used to finding information about any question I have immediately, how easily can I find immediate information about my parish or my faith or the theological question that I have, and an answer that I understand that meets me at my level of understanding or knowledge or what I want to see? That's not a passing, oh, that's a cute question. That's not too technical, but something that fits, right? So again, there's a generational expectation of 95% of what I want to know, I can search and I've got it. Can I do that when it comes to faith, right? If I have a question, I go find an answer. It's there someplace. I get it. If I want to know, who do I talk to about music in my parish? Because I'm a piano player and I'd like to get involved. Do I have to click 7 times in your website to find who I would go after or contact? Or is it something that like is immediately discoverable to me, right? Again, I can use the internet to research things, but I'm also an independent thinker. This is the generation of people who have grown up with the internet, but also have grown up with information literacy throughout their curriculum. So yes, I see stuff on social media, and yes, I see stuff on Wikipedia, but I'm not at the point of it's on the internet, it must be true. I'm more discerning about the information. Again, by and large, I'm sure we can come up with specific examples where that's not true, but by and large, my curriculum teaches me that. This one I think is huge for the church, and this is a point that I suggest this is not a criticism whatsoever. But if you think about my children are fortunate enough to know their great-grandfather, my dad's dad. He's 91. And he tells them the example all the time of when he started going to school. They called it first grade because that was the first grade he went to school. And now my kids, within his lifetime, before first grade, have a year of kindergarten, have 2 years of preschool, and then have 2 years of early childhood education. It's not full-time, right? And even at daycare, they're doing colors and numbers and things, right? So they're preparing earlier. We have calculus, it's a matter of course in many high schools, right? So earlier and earlier, we're doing more and more, and we're extending knowledge. It's an expectation you go to some post-secondary education option. We still don't begin our catechesis or theological formation until, you know, later on, and we end it fairly early. And so if I'm used to constantly learning more and more and more and more, and then at a certain point, 10th grade in my diocese, boom, catechesis and liturgical formation, theological formation ends. How does that then look to me or compare to my other experience when it comes to education? A couple more, and then I'm going to stop because I know Jenna's going to answer a question here. If we think about the culture of fear, what that means is, if we think about all of the things that a current younger person has grown up knowing happens in the world, the things we see stuff live on the news, we see stuff on Facebook Live, we see things on YouTube, we hear about things constantly. There is not the naivete that might have marked some other generations. And then finally, my kids, we limit their screen time, but it's amazing what they instinctively can do, especially through school, creating and choosing information of their own accord. If that's what I'm used to, if I'm used to things working 95% of the time elsewhere, but it doesn't happen when I intersect with my faith community, that's going to be a turnoff, but it's also going to be an exclusionary message. So if we think about, again, what's true, and we start to interpret that to what does that mean for the practice or experience of people in parishes, it can perhaps be instructive. Jenna, I know you want to address one of the questions that we've had come in.
Sure, thanks. Sorry, this is a little bit off the topic of what you were just talking about, Matt, but I thought it would be an interesting question, particularly since GIA is a music publisher, and I know Chris is a fellow musician as well. Andrew Remick asked, oftentimes, you know, certain genres of music get associated with, this is music that youth likes or Generation Z likes or young adults like. But given what we've been talking about, that there is a range of spiritualities in any given cohort, you know, how do we move away from getting stuck in a particular style for a particular generation toward an array of genres? And to kind of add on to Drew's question, because I'm not certain that I have a totally adequate answer, you know, I think it brings up too, how do we maintain the treasury of traditional hymnody that has lasted and been meaningful in our church's tradition? So, I mean, I would love to hear what you guys have to say, but my immediate reaction to Drew's question, I think it's an important one. My immediate reaction was, yeah, I think we have to stop, you know, just putting generations in boxes and saying, well, this generation likes this music and this generation likes this music, and having our youth mass, and then we have our, you know, older adults mass, and then we have our family mass, and kind of dividing maybe our parish that way, but rather helping all generations to kind of appreciate and pray with a diversity of styles, a diversity of genres. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Chris and Matt.
There's it's cool because you hit it right on the head, Jenna, about the you can't just box any group of people in, not even just young people, any group of people. You can't say, oh, this is how they would prefer to pray, this is the music that would be effective for them in worship. You can't do anything like that. And working with young people in youth ministry, just in a general youth ministry setting, and in youth catechism, one thing that I've picked up along the way is that young people of any generation, but specifically these newer ones, Gen Z and even Alpha and stuff like that, there's a desire for real authenticity when it comes to serving them. When it comes to, this is what I want to offer for you, this is what I want to give to you. If there's any even a little speck of inauthenticity to it, these young kids, they can smell it. They can smell it, and they're like, oh, you're just throwing me a bone because you think I like bones. You know what I mean? And it's the same thing with our programs. You know, if you try to say, hey guys, we're going to be young and hip and check this shiny flashy thing out, then that's not going to be entirely successful. I mean, think about the pandemic and the way that the world has changed with the pandemic. So many youth ministries and even music ministries had to go to a distance digital version of their ministry, whereas we were leading youth nights every week of 80 kids in person, 80 kids plus 15 team members in person, almost 100 people doing a youth night, to now we can't gather at all anymore. And instead, we started making, in my parish, we started making YouTube videos for the kids to watch. And we put up the first one, we made it all flashy, and we put little meme cuts and funny things and stuff like that. And they were commenting how hilarious it was, just cracking up. Oh my gosh, I love this. This is great, blah, blah, blah. Fast forward 5 weeks from that, and when we were trying to do the same thing, they were sick of it. They're like, no, this isn't cool anymore. The first couple times you did it, that was great, but this is just the same old stuff. You think that we just like the same stuff over and over and over and over again? That's not necessarily true. We want stuff that's real, stuff that feels real, and it's the same with parish music ministry. You know, there are some musicians out there that they think, okay, when I'm an OCP artist, and so OCP has this resource called Spirit and Song. And Spirit and Song, the very first one came out like in the 90s, right? so some of the cool hip songs from that are like, I Could Sing of Your Love Forever. And so there are some people that say, oh, I'm gonna be with teenagers today at a teenage mass. Let's sing I Could Sing It Over the Mountains and the Sea. And the kids are just rolling their eyes like, what is this? You know what I mean? Right. They evolved along with how contemporary music evolved also. And that's not to say that old music is dumb or anything like that. I'm talking about the authenticity behind it. That you think, just because I'm with young people, this is what they like. This is their thing. I'm going to throw them their young people bone. And that's not true. You have to search deep. And Matt talked about this before we began, but I think we're going to get into this a little bit also. Relationship is so important when it comes to any ministry. If you actually get to know the people you're working with, be them young or old or anything in between, then you'll start discovering, this specifically is what this person likes. Not this specifically is what this group of people prefers, but this specific person. And when it comes to music ministry, you'll discover that your parish has its own preferences of what the people, what is effective with the people, what hymns are effective, what styles are effective with the people. And you can't just copy and paste that to another parish or to another mass. Every liturgy is specific. And so, some people think, I'm doing a teenager young adult mass, I'm just going to start singing Oceans and they're going to start crying, Oceans by Hillsong or something. It's not necessarily true. You need to discover what that person deeply needs. And the only way you're going to discover that is by having a relationship with that person. So,
yeah, I think authenticity is, really important, as well as, leading the music in a way that shows you're trying to enable participation, right? You're trying to bring your congregation into prayer, whoever that may be. And since you mentioned Oceans, Chris, at this last high school I worked at, we did Oceans at like every single school liturgy. And I was teaching a class on sacraments and liturgy, and my students said to me, are there other songs that we could be doing? And I think that we were doing it so often because our campus minister wanted students to know the words and know the music and be able to sing along. But they said, we don't have to sing it at every mass. We'd love to learn new music. So, knowing what your congregation is capable of learning more things and bringing their experiences into it is important as well.
I think that's a great example, and I'm glad, Chris, that you identified the this watchword of authenticity. And I know we're running a little short on time, but I'd like to spend some time talking about what we mean by that, right? So we've got a few things coming through in the chat here. Michael Jonkis posted in the chat that he just finished reading a new book by Nathaniel Marks coming out from Lit Press entitled Authentic Liturgy. So that's something for everyone to keep an eye out on. I think, and I think you started to answer the how do we define authenticity by talking about that relationship. And I think if we look at, if I'm a younger person, or frankly, if I'm a person of any generation, does it feel like my community understands what my life experience is like, and the things that are keeping me up at night, and the things I'm really excited about, and the things that are important to me, right? I think that's a question all of us seek to answer. As a father of younger children, as a married person, I love it whenever there's something that I can see matches my experience or honors my own experience. How much more true or equally true is that for someone in high school, where oftentimes, do we hear in the intercessions? Do we hear in the homily? Do we hear in the bulletin notes? Do we hear in any outreach anything about what the actual authentic experience in 2020 is like for a student in high school or college, the things we're worried about? But also when it comes to relationship and authenticity, I think oftentimes there's a lot of hunger to understand. If I, back to the characteristics of Generation Z at least, if I'm someone who my days are governed by the curriculum in my school, and everything is chosen so carefully because it's important and it fits, and this is what we have to spend time on, and we're going to, we assess prior knowledge and we build knowledge and we move on to apply it because you're going to need it. How do we function in similar ways within our parish communities? We presume a lot of prior knowledge, and so that can be exclusive. I don't know what you're talking about when you talk about Vatican II, because we assume people know about it, right? Or we assume there is no prior knowledge, so we don't fill in the prior knowledge, right? So we sing the same stuff over and over. In my experience, and I don't know about you, Chris, when you're on the road, but one call, I mean, we sing everything from hymnody to Latin chant to psalm tones to praise and worship to stuff from the 70s to current things to you name it, to polyphony, and the kids love it all. Yes. But we also help them understand what this is and why it's meaningful and the text and everything else, and they love it. If I don't have a relationship with it, if I don't understand it, I'm not going to do it. And so are we prepared to teach the reasons for why we do things or not? Alan Hummerding writes a lot about the evaporation of hymn tunes in our repertoire because we don't do them, and so therefore we feel like there are fewer and fewer. But how do we do and explain, because kids want to know that there's something worthwhile. And I apologize for you saying kids because it's pejorative, and I that's an old habit and I name it for myself. But for younger people, how do we continue to teach and explain and build that prior knowledge, I think is something important, and then give the chance for it. And I think in all of that, if we explain, if we build that relationship, if we reflect that we get what it's like, the experience of someone, regardless of generation, in an outward way, I think that starts to bear fruit. Then Liz Owen asked the question, effective recruitment strategies for volunteers in various generations. I think some of that is people will be involved in a community where they can see their experience reflected, right? I think there are some other do's and don'ts and things we can get to, but once we start to build a practice that reflects and honors that experience, then some of that starts to build on its own. I don't know if any of the things that I just mentioned resonate with you, Jenna, or with you, Chris, if you want to respond to any of that.
I think the things that you said about one call and some of the other practices and everything, I think those are absolutely true. I think young people will very much surprise you. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you're working with young people, they'll surprise you with the variety of prayer style that they're open to. They'll surprise you, you don't have to just throw them the hottest, newest thing when it comes to music or just ministry in general, or even catechism. If you give them something that's really good, something really good to chew on, something that you believe in, like talk about authenticity again, then you would be surprised how they would receive it. That in a youth mass, you could sing something brand new by Matt Maher or Chris Tomlin, but then if you if you truly introduce to them something, something great, even if it was written a long time ago, like there's a reception that they'll receive. They'll receive it and they'll say, wow, that has nice value. You can sing "You Are Near" by Dan Schutte, which is from the 70s or whatever it is, and a young person could start crying. You have no idea. You can't assume one way or another. And just to keep the conversation with variety, working with older people is also, you have to treat it the same way too. You can't, there's old people at this mass, I better sing "Lift High the Cross" for every single song or something like that. That's not necessarily true either. There is older people in my parish community that their favorite song is "Go Out, Go Out" by Curtis Stevens. So it's like that. You can never just pigeonhole somebody and say that based off of how old you are, this is what's best for you. And I think it's great what you guys are doing with One Call, how you introduce brand new stuff as well as stuff that's pretty ancient, but you guys present it with an authenticity and with the intentionality that it is well received by the young people. And I think that applies not just to music, but to every ministry that you work with different generations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but what I'd like to do, and we're going to go a minute or two over, but what I'd like to do sort of for the last part of the conversation is, Jenna and Chris, I'd like to sort of invite you to think about or formulate now either a final thought or a takeaway or something that you would encourage or challenge people who are listening either live or to the recording of this to do in the coming weeks or coming months or start of the school year ahead. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. For those of you who are watching live, we are recording this. So if you'd like to come back and watch any of this, you can do that. It'll be up, rebroadcast tomorrow on GIA's Facebook page, but also put on our YouTube channel so you can share this with other people. For my final thing, one of the things I would encourage people to think about is, again, to think about those period and cohort effects and how that informs the structure of your practice and how that informs structure. And we've gotten questions and things in the chat about invitation, everything, and all that is exactly right. One of the things I see people run into danger or challenge is I can come up with a snappy way to invite people. But if I'm not inviting them into a structure that's going to work, that invitation falls flat. And then the message is there's something wrong with you, or you don't belong, or weren't important enough, etc. In a time when we have a period and cohort that are super overscheduled, who that has been a part of their lived experience. That's the culture. That's not a choice. That's the expectation. If my rehearsals are always Monday night at 7, do I have to move that, or do I have to find a different time to work with the younger person to engage them? Or is it just, I invite you, but because you can't make it because of other things, and therefore you can't participate? How do we think again about period and cohort realities, but also then address our structure so that people can come, people can show up, people can accept invitations and still be involved? So for me, I encourage people to think about structural realities. Jenna, if you've got a final thought or a takeaway or a challenge you'd like to leave people with.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I just think as, we all begin to dig more into generational theory and learning about Gen Z, millennials, all the way down the line, also examining like what people are going through at particular moments in their lives. And in the context of this pandemic, all of the big transitions and events that are taking place that aren't being ritually celebrated or marked in the ways that we're so used to. So middle school, high school graduations, college graduations. I attended a virtual wedding this weekend. Anniversaries that usually, are blessed within the community of our churches. Funerals, births, baptisms, just all these things that seem to be kind of on pause or in this odd middle space because of where we're at in the pandemic. Thinking about ways that we can honor those transitions in a way that will be relevant and meaningful to whichever generation you're working with. So whether that looks like an in-person, distanced creative solution to a high school graduation, or when we're all able to gather someday back together in church, if it's a blessing each weekend, right, for those who graduated in the past year or two, or for all those who got married in the past year. Making sure that we're attending to these really important things in people's lives, moves and new jobs, and new babies that haven't been really celebrated in the context of our communities. I think that'll just build up our parishes, certainly, in our communities, as intergenerational.
That's great. Chris, how about you?
When it comes to working with young people, I would just say something like they need to be young people need to be invited to the table in whatever format. So many parishes around the country, young people are viewed as only being valuable for two things: technology and manpower, setting up tables and chairs. But they need to be invited, and young people need to be involved in the planning process for things in their parish community and in their ministries and in their lives. There's and if it I don't want to take away from the fact that young people are good at setting up chairs and tables, because they actually are. They're actually a very good manpower force for that. But that can't be the only thing that they are. They need to be welcome to be part of the planning. And if you as a parish, you as parish ministers are asking young people to do things like that, like labor things, then you need to say thank you. You need to say thank you, and you need to mean it. You need to be authentic. And you'll discover that understanding is a two-way street. It's not that we as older people need to just understand the young people, but when you do, they'll begin to understand you back. And sometimes someone has to be the first one to take that step forward. So.
Wonderful. Thank you both for helping us scratch the surface on this important topic. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to all of you who were able to join us live. Thanks to those of you who are watching this archive video. Again, please share it with friends, share it with colleagues. Let us know what other questions we can answer in the weeks ahead as we're all in this together. Thank you for joining us for this summer series conversation. We have so many more conversations this week and next week into week 5. We hope you'll join us for another conversation or view the archive videos on our Facebook page or YouTube channel. So thank you for everything you're doing for your communities and everything you're doing for your own ministry and practice to improve outreach and engagement across generations, across cultures, whatever it might be. Know that your efforts are being seen and appreciated. And we hope that we'll see you on another summer series conversation soon. So thanks for being with us. God bless. Have a wonderful day. See you.